How's everybody doing? I feel like I'm like a stand-up comic or something. They told me to keep it light, so I might talk about what does Jim Gaffigan do? Just talk about being fat. I can do that. So, God. Sometimes you feel like God is playing his own jokes, on you. I've been thinking about this talk for a really long time, as Sarah just said. Okay, yeah, maybe I'll move to the middle. I don't have any backup singers today. So I've been thinking about this for a really long time, and I've just felt like as I've been taking it to prayer and trying to work through it. Hold on, let me just check the time. I got till 25 minutes. Okay. I just kept on feeling like the message, what I was supposed to share wasn't really there yet. I ended up putting together about 10 pages worth of notes. Kept on thinking everything, it's going to come together. Like God's just going to show up at a certain point. It's going to be like, this is exactly what you're supposed to talk about. Had a really powerful experience last night. Came back, basically got rid of everything that I had written. Wrote a new talk from 1:30 to 3, and then had a hard time sleeping. And the thing is I didn't even feel any peace, really. I felt good. I felt like, all right, this is what you want me to do, God, but I don't really want to do this talk. And then this is the joke, right? I'm standing in the back, and I'm kind of fighting it, right? I'm fighting, I think, where I'm supposed to go, and then they start playing the hymn, and it's just like that hymn is it's like my hymn, so I kind of heard God laughing in that, showing up here. Before I get in too deep, how's everybody doing? How was your experience last night? Last year, and I'll get into this in my story, but last year, the Saturday night session was really a pivotal time for me. I felt like I had a real breakthrough as an individual, as a Catholic. The name of the talk is Secrets of the Garden. I've had a couple people ask me what the secrets are. You'll have to listen to the whole talk to find out. But I'd like to just get started actually with the story. And the story has to do with my son, Henry. About 6 years ago, I moved from Buffalo, New York, where my wife and I are both from, to Cincinnati. My wife was about 7 months pregnant, yeah. And it was a difficult transition for us. She was very close to their family. Had never been outside Buffalo before, and moving when you're 7 months pregnant, leaving a job, all that, it's really difficult. So it was a trying time for us, trying time for our marriage. But I had so much excitement around the prospect of my son being born. You think about it, it's like that is like the pinnacle of creativity and like co-creation, right? This idea of your own child. And I had this idea in my mind. I don't know where I got this from, maybe a movie or something, but I thought, okay, I'm gonna get in there, and this birth's gonna happen, and I'm gonna be there, and God's just gonna be like so present, and it's just gonna be this really deep spiritual experience, almost like I'm in like adoration or this or that, right? And what I found, and for anyone who's either given birth or been in a room where a woman's giving birth, it's not like that at all. It's actually extremely intense. I would say even like violent. There's this veil of life and death that's kind of like tearing in like real time, right? Like it's so intense, this feeling of life, and so intense, this possibility of death. And for a man, I'm not even going to project what it's like for the woman, but for a man, it's really difficult. You don't feel like you have control. You have to sit back. You have to watch. You have to trust. And that's hard. It's hard for me. It was hard for me then. I've gotten better with it now that I have 3, but really difficult stuff. And one of the reasons I was struggling trying to prepare this talk is I was trying to think about creativity. I was trying to think about the Renaissance, I was trying to think about gardens, and I'm like, where are all these things fit together? I hope I've worked that out, but I'm not a historian. I actually don't think I know a ton about, there's probably a lot of people who know a lot more about the Renaissance than I do, but one thing that is really clear in the research I had done was that, the Renaissance is really marked by a spirit of optimism and hope and creativity. It's just this tremendous flourishing of that. And what's fascinating is on the flip side of that, what's really clear is one of the fundamental causes was the Black Death, where a third of the population is wiped out. So how does it happen that out of this tremendous pain, this tremendous death, is this new life? When I talked to Anthony the first time about doing a talk today, I had explained, we were trying to figure out what would be appropriate for me to speak about, and I was explaining how I feel like I've been going through my own Renaissance in my own life, personally. And I remember on the phone, we spent like an hour and a half on the phone, and I remember him asking me, what is it that leads to, like, what is it, so I get it, like, I get all this stuff you're saying, but what actually got you there? Like, what was it that actually did that? And I had a really hard time, like, expressing it. I think it wasn't probably until this last week, really working through this, that I've really been able to, like, clearly express it. But it's been a real process. I'm not going to get too much into my story or my reversion or upbringing, but when I was in college, I became an agnostic, and then had a pretty radical reversion, which led me down a path in ministry. And I don't know if you've ever experienced, but people who are reverts or converts, especially if it's a really intense thing, there can be this like sense where they're really zealous, right? Like, it's sometimes really annoying, actually, right? Like, they're so zealous and so, like, fired up. You're like, all right, settle down, like, a little bit. I felt like very really, like I had been drowning in the water and was pulled out. And there was a sense I walked away from that of, I'm totally indebted in some ways. And I need to really go and just give my life to God and try and serve God, which led me on a path to ministry. I just discerned that was what I was being called to, and I started a Catholic radio network. I found a lot of success there in a pretty short amount of time, but I felt God calling me to something else at a certain point, and that's what ultimately led me to Dynamic Catholic. I was something like the 14th employee. Joined as the webmaster, and something similar happened there as well. There was this it seemed like all this stuff just kind of fell into place, right? And I found myself having a lot of success. I started as the webmaster. I started managing some people as the organization grew. I became the director of communications. I moved into a role of COO, and actually last year, leading up to the summit, I was in that role, and I was thinking the plan was to actually have me move into like a CEO type role, right? So you can imagine what that does for a person who's I don't know what I must have been 29. How old am I? I'm 31. So I must have been 30. But you can imagine for a 30-year-old the prospect of leading this like 90-person organization that a lot of people respect and all these things, right? And in a lot of ways, that's something that I think, if we're honest with ourselves, like we all desire, right? We all desire to be seen and approved of and affirmed as like you have what it takes. You are successful, whatever that might look like. And I think in some ways a mark of a creative is their willingness to be vulnerable, to take risks, to put themselves out there. But the correlation of that is it's even more of a struggle, because with that there's a real temptation to put the walls up, right? When you put yourself out there, you can really get hurt. And so the need for affirmation for people who are creatives is sometimes even higher, because it has to be. Our egos are fragile, and we do what we can to get by. you know? And so that was the context coming into the summit. And I had, in some ways, it was an incredible time in my life. And in other ways, it was deeply stressful, with a lot of pressure I had on myself. One of the fruits of poverty is you don't have that much to defend, to grasp, to cling onto, to control. There's a real temptation when you have power, when you have influence or control, to want to grasp that, and also to want to control it. And there's also a tremendous temptation to pride, right? And all that does. Pope Francis would talk about how pride is almost, or success, power, he says. Power is almost, it's like alcohol, and you start getting drunk, and you just make bad decisions, you know? And you see that. You turn on the news, it's a reoccurring pattern. You go into Scripture, it's a reoccurring pattern. And that was the stage to some degree that I was coming into. And on Saturday night's event, Chuck Hanane, who, if you guys know Chuck, does anybody know Chuck? Yeah. So Chuck Hanane, who I really respect. He's an incredible guy. He gave a talk, really opened up his heart, and then we had a similar prayer time. And I remember I was in my small group. I don't even know if I shared this, but at a certain point, I didn't really want to talk, because I felt like something was being revealed to me about myself that was really shifting. God was doing something in my heart, in real time, right? So what happened is I started to realize that I was putting all this emphasis on this art I was creating, right? I have to make this impact. I have to do these things. I have to give of myself and be this creator that creates these things, right? And I just felt like God really clearly saying to me, no, you got it wrong. You are the art, and you're co-creating with me, right? And all that other stuff is it just flows out of that. It's far ancillary. It really changed me, because it made me start thinking about the idea that the process in the Christian life is as important, certainly as important as end results, right? It has to do with being in the present moment, allowing God to work, being responsive to what he's doing. And God, there's a process to every person's life. Right now, at this very moment, there's a process to your life that's playing out, that God is doing something new in your heart. You may see it right now, you may not. You may see it a few days from now, you may see it a couple years from now, but right now God is doing something new in your life. God is doing something new in the Catholic Church. And God was doing something new in me. And as I said, God has a process for things, and that was part of the process, because pretty soon afterwards, I moved into I don't know what to call it, maybe a season of discord or something. And stuff started to change with my role. The plan for me started to change. And I felt kind of like a kid who had built this sandcastle with my flag in it, watching the tide slowly start chipping away at what I built. I'd invested, I think, a lot. I'd put probably a lot of my ego into that. And so when that happened, extremely painful. It's actually, it's hard to really fully communicate it, right? It's just so personal. But it really broke me. It broke me, and I had told Anthony this on the phone. The only thing I could really explain in terms of my own little renaissance was I was I just got brought to my knees. Renaissance literally translates to rebirth. I think that whenever we're experiencing a renaissance, there's always a certain level of darkness that precedes it. That was certainly the case for me. What ended up happening is as all these things I had kind of built an edifice around started to fade, what was left was actually me and God. And I realized that a lot of this other stuff was not actually even me. And it's really hard to explain, but I've never felt as connected with myself, as creative, as free walking with God as I do now. And I love the birth analogy because, the first word that comes out of every child's mouth is a loud cry. You could argue if that's a word or not. I have the microphone, so you can't do that. The first word that comes out is a loud cry, right? And you think about it, they've been in this place, right? Which ultimately is actually a place of darkness, but they feel safe in it. And then through this painful process, they get pushed out of this world that they know, and the security that they felt like they had is taken away. It's stripped away. They don't have a choice, right? Like they're being pushed out. And ultimately into a better reality. The parent can see that, but the child can't. The child actually, if you have kids, young kids, they want to be swaddled, right? They want to pretend like they're back in the womb, even though they're not. And there's also a transition period, right? I love the image, like in Scripture, when Jesus talks about people who have eyes to see and ears to hear, and just even that image of moving into what I think is these phases of births into the kingdom, right? And learning to see, just like a baby learns to see, right? Like a baby does not come out fully seeing. They see images and blurred things, and they can't even remember object permanence, right? And over time, they start to have a different level of perception, a different level of reality, and they're seeing in full color and in full light. And the parent, although they're no longer in that womb, cares just as much, but they have greater freedom. And the parent's still there. The parent just is parenting in a different way. I love the ecology references that have been taking place. I think the idea of nature, how nature plays out, how creation reflects our interior creation, and to steal from Al Gore, I think that there's an inconvenient truth about the Renaissance. And the inconvenient truth is that it's much, much easier to talk about starting a Renaissance or this movement that's out there rather than in here. I don't know if, I imagine a lot of you have been in church circles for a while, but it's not very uncommon you go to a men's group, a Bible study, this or that, where sure enough, after a while, you start talking about the problems with everybody else. The problem is, this group in the church, they just don't get this. Or the problem is, like, men aren't like, and the thing is people can waste like an hour of their life focusing on all these things that have nothing to do with them because they have no influence over it. And I think that ultimately it's actually a distraction. We find ways to continuously distract ourselves from the things that scare us, from the places we don't want to go, often within ourselves, the places that God wants to desperately go, because it's in those areas where we're transformed, and then are able to actually bear this fruit in our interactions with other people. And the inconvenient truth is that to have a Renaissance kind of sucks. That actually wasn't in my talk. That was an ad lib. So it kind of sucks, you know. And I think that principally underneath all of it, the creatives who are here, the creatives in general, are in such a unique position to impact and live out a full life with God and actually do what a Renaissance calls for. Because what it takes to be a creative is the same thing it takes to grow spiritually. In my opinion, that's courage. It takes courage to be honest with yourself. It takes courage to embrace reality as it is, not as you want it to be. It takes courage to live in the present moment rather than to live in the future or the past. It takes courage to love people you don't want to love. It takes courage to love yourself and to trust God. That's an act of courage. I think that this room, there's probably a lot of people and there's a lot of people who trust God. But I think if we're all honest, we're holding back on some level, right? That might not be true. I suspect it is. I am. We're holding back on some level, right? And fundamentally, it's a question of courage. And where does courage come from? This is something that I've struggled with. This idea of I remember talking to someone specifically about this. How do you get someone to trust God? Because if they were raised and they're wounded and hurt, like how can you get them to just trust God? Their trust isn't it? Don't they have to experience God's love first, or this or that? And the point this woman had made is, it takes courage and confidence, and it is a little bit of a chicken and the egg dilemma. But the good news is, it's not really our problem so much as something we need to go do, because the process is already taking place. Our courage comes from knowing that the one who began a good work in us will be faithful to complete that good work. Our courage comes from knowing that we are not the primary person who is creating the image on the canvas. We're an instrument, and we just have to show up. We have to show up. I believe that the spiritual life is not, it's not easy, but it is simple. And a lot of it comes down to just showing up. So, thank you all for your time. That's it.